Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Curiosities in Psychology. So today I'm joined by Alison Devine, who is from Perth, Western Australia, and works with perpetrators of domestic violence. So it's a bit of an intense topic today, so I will just put out a trigger warning at the start for anyone who might find it difficult discussing or listening to this topic. But we're going to be discussing how you get into a field like this, looking at the common psychological factors or the health of men who commit these acts, and also how Alison works with them to overcome their own trauma and to ensure that they're living better lives so that others around them are able to as well. So welcome, Alison. Thank you for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
So when you first messaged me about doing this podcast, the first question that kind of popped into my head was, how do you get into this field, or what motivated you to enter this field to start with?
So believe it or not, this was a field that I absolutely didn't want to get into. So I remember when I was doing my training qualification, they sort of ask you what areas do you want to work in. So my undergrad is social work. And so it was mostly around families, helping families, capacity building, case management, that sort of stuff with more high risk mental health families. I've then I've had two kids now down the track, and basically it got to the point where I was like, I've got two kids now. I want to sort of more engage in the counseling aspect, so I'm not doing so much outreach, running around, because I'm also getting tired.
Yep.
So I started my counseling qualification, my master's, and then as part of that, I remember we did a topic on shame, a session. It was called Personal Issues in Counseling. And so when you do the Personal Issues in Counseling session, one of the topics in there was around like shame and what's your most triggering client. And the whole top idea was to experience that shame, experience what it's like to work with that client and push through in a way, or figure out how you could, because we're all going to have those clients that are triggering clients and we don't know how to work with it. So until this point, I was quite a quiet, like soft spoken, more the caring, because I'm working with families, mostly women, children. And they said, "What's your triggering client?" And I said, "It's actually a perpetrator of domestic violence. It would be a man who's not caring about his impact on others. It would be a man who just, takes control of the situation, talks over you, has no respect for you as a counselor." And I basically described this client. And then the lecturer goes, "Now I want you to pick someone and role play it." And I was like, "Oh crap." um I remember, like, so then we started role playing it, and it was the weirdest thing. I just totally got triggered, and I froze. So this guy was role playing it. He's just talking, chat, 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 and then I'm just sitting there completely frozen, hands in my lap, like looking like serene, like that the counselor face, but in my head I'm like, oh my god. So then he comes up to me, the lecturer taps out, and he's like, "Are you okay? What's happening?" And I told him what had happened, and he goes, what are you thinking?" And I said, "Well, I feel like I'm in this game of like double dutch, where if you're jumping rope, and if you miss the timing, you're going to get slapped in the face with that rope." And he
Yeah.
goes, "Well, why don't you just use your body and feed that back to him?" And I was like,
Mhm.
"What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, just tell him what's coming up for you. Don't paraphrase what he's saying. Don't challenge him. Just tell him how it's making you feel, the impact of his behaviors on you." And I was like, "Can you do that?" And he's like, "Yes, you can." So restarted the scenario. It started talking. I got triggered again, and that took a minute. And I just gave him that feedback. And because the actor wasn't planning for that either, it kind of shocked him into, oh, okay, well, I am having an impact on her even in my role play. And it was part of that whole personal issues and counseling unit that I sort of realized how shame was preventing me from engaging and being vulnerable. And then as a result, how I was also like being triggered by this person, but it was more on that I was fighting it on a cognitive level. I wasn't thinking it through with like head and heart.
Yeah.
So after that session, I remember I went back and was speaking to one of my coordinators, and she goes, "We've got this new program that's come up working with men. Why don't you actually try it out?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely not." Again, she's like, "No, I think your personality would be quite good. You're quite like a bubbly, chatty person. Just go sit in on some groups, and as a result, tell me what you think." So the program that I was part of for about 5 to 6 years, 5.5 years, was basically when men have been charged with the pointy end of the domestic violence scale. So when they've been uh, sentenced for like they breaking the law, whether it's a breach of a VRO, whether it's physical violence, sexual, whatever it is. they'll be ordered to do a men's behaviour change program. And so the program that I went into was said men's behaviour change program. It went for 24 weeks, and it would basically have like psychoeducation as the biggest component of that. Um, so I remember sitting in this group, and before you go in, I did my homework. I read up. You get this statement of material facts, which is what the police write about the person when they go to investigate the unit, and it's part of the sentencing. So I read up on all these people, was all prepared. In my head, I had this idea of what a stereotypical perpetrator would look like.
Yeah.
And I remember like there was one particular guy who had used uh, like a knife to his partner, and so I had this absolute idea of what he'd be like, how he'd speak,
Yep.
what he'd do. Went into the room and I was shocked. It was just a room of 6 men who could have been your next door neighbor. It could have been your uncle. It could have been, the person you work with, that you could have like a chatty barbecue conversation with. And
Yeah.
the guy who held a knife to his partner, I was shocked by how soft spoken and how, like in my head, I also pictured like a bigger man, thinking like
Yeah.
intimate partner violence, like a knife, it's going to be big. He was
Yeah.
quite a smaller man and very soft spoken and almost like very little, like the regressed arrested development sort of, presentation of a man, like almost
Mm.
like a little boy.
Mm.
And so that really shocked me too. And I remember talking to I didn't actually facilitate, I just observed it. And I remember speaking to one of the facilitators and saying, how do you marry those two images up in your head? How do you marry up what you think a perpetrator would look like and who these people are in group, and how do you hold
Yeah.
that accountability space? How do you engage with them? And he was like, you have to find that vulnerability again. You have to connect to that trauma aspect of vulnerability and engage with them. And once they feel safe in that engagement, that's when you'll be able to challenge them and hold them accountable and really sort of, you know, push some of those harder topics with them around masculinity or their use of violence, or the fact that, perhaps their dad was abusive and now they're like a duplicate version of their dad. So those sorts of topics you can broach with them, but it's that initial thing of helping them feel safe around you and, working with them from that, I guess for me, it's that attachment space.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. I feel the same as you did in terms of like feeling triggered by working with particular clients. I was thinking that at the start of this podcast, like how do
Yeah,
you work with clients who are triggering for you? But yeah, it's interesting what you said about how they just look like you have this idea in your head of what they would look like. But
yeah,
yeah, it's just like everyday clients. It's the same as, to psych practice. You imagine
yeah,
what people look like given the description of all these things that have
yeah,
happened, but they're just average people. And yeah, it's strange to kind of fit that together. Um, you mentioned shame and that can be a big barrier to change as well when we were discussing this before the podcast,
yeah.
like individual shame and shame from the media. And we'll discuss further later about media stereotypes as well. But how do you address and kind of understand further the shame that these men feel, and what strategies have you found that are effective in kind of helping them to overcome it?
Yeah. I think shame is one of those emotions that for most of us, it's that visceral, gut churning, really uncomfortable, emotion. And I think
Mm.
unless you come into connection with your shame and your experience of shame and you understand your experience of shame, I don't think, and I guess I'm generalizing from my personal practice of working with men, but I don't think you can connect with other people in their shame space until you understand and unpack your shame space, because to be able to hold them in their space, it requires, a lot of like your personal, like your heart and soul connecting with that. And if you're not able to understand your own shame, you're not going to be able to connect with theirs. So that
Mm.
would be, I guess, the first part of the question, which is how do you work, like how do you understand shame, or how do you sort of address that? The other thing about shame, like again for me, was a lot of the work that I do is almost like I've done the work, so then I sort of not pass it on, but I kind of help them do it in a very similar way because I'm quite a, what's the word, practical person. And I guess
Yep.
that's why I also love working with men, because men are also practical people. So,
Mm.
for example, so once I understood like that personal issues in counseling was such a pivotal unit for me that it triggered so much shame in like all my vulnerabilities, whether it was working with my triggering client. There was another session where we had to give each other feedback. And the feedback I was getting wasn't even bad feedback. It was positive feedback, but my inability to take that in and allow that, I ended up crying, and then I felt shame from that. And then I remember I went back to uni the following week, and I was so triggered by shame that I went in with like a baseball hat, like, you know, a hat like really low, big jacket. It was winter, so I could
Yeah.
get away with it. But I was so shamed, and I sat right at the back of the class and was trying to like slump down in my chair. And so that experience was so pivotal for me to understand shame, and that sort of, I guess, engaged me in my own learning of it. So I started doing, there's this book called Shame by Joseph Burgo, I believe, where he actually unpacks the whole idea of shame. So he talks about shame as like an umbrella, where,
Yeah.
you know, it's a word that we all avoid, but realistically there's different versions of shame, like embarrassment, humiliation, toxic shame. There's different versions of it, and we all feel shame at different points in the day even, and we don't even think about it. So it's by just understanding how toxic shame is what people think when they think shame. So I'll sort of unpack that with a men. So I'll say shame, like any other emotion, is a protection emotion, just like anger is, just like, you know, sadness is. It's telling you something is wrong in your body. So, and the way shame protects you is, I'll say, for example, little Johnny is jumping off the table repeatedly. And then when mum tells him off, it's going to give him that experience of shame because he's done something wrong. But then mum's going to come back later, give him a hug, and still tell him she loves him. So he's had this experience of like being told something was wrong, having a bit of a shaming moment, embarrassment, but then mum's gone and fixed that rupture.
Hmm.
However, where toxic shame becomes like the issue is when little Johnny is jumping off the table and the chair, and mum's just yelling at him, but not fixing the ruptures. That's when Johnny goes from learning, I've done bad, to I am bad. Like mum's
Hmm.
constantly yelling at me because I am bad. So I say to them, think of shame as a continuum. Toxic shame is on one end, which is I am bad at all those awful things. Guilt is, you know, on this end, which guilt is like an acting. It's like it's an action call. You can work on guilt because you want to fix things, and shame is somewhere in the middle. Like it's neither a bad or a good emotion. It's just a middle emotion, and I get them to actually map on like the internal map on the wall, either on the board or on their piece of paper or internally, where they're sitting with their shame. Do they have
Yeah.
toxic shame? Do they have generic shame? They feel like everybody else, or do they have guilt? You know, and a lot of the times, men that are using domestic violence are in that toxic shame space. You know, they
Yeah.
truly believe that they are a deficit in so many different ways. Like I remember one guy said, for me, shame is like an island and I'm on it alone all the time. So, helping them understand the purpose of shame and even creating the space in the group where they can be vulnerable and sitting with the shame, and also uh, accepting other men's shame. That actually is like a huge healing space that I've seen for a lot of people.
Yeah. So do you primarily work in groups or work individually with the men as well? How does the
Both.
session kind of both? Yeah.
So it goes both. Well, actually, the program that I've been primarily doing for the past 7 years was through the majority was through the justice system, the mandated guys. And
Yeah.
there I had twins during COVID. So I took a bit of a break, and then I went
Mhm.
into the volunteer space, like where men were either ordered through family court or, you know, a work or even like a social mandate from a partner. So I was in that space for a while, but I sort of found in both of those spaces, um, the biggest focus was on like psychoeducation and just the 24 weeks. There wasn't any wraparound case management or counseling around it. Like the men would just come for the 24 sessions, and then that would be it. Like there was no other like
Yeah.
ongoing support. There wasn't anything else. And
Mm.
some of the organizations also say when the man's doing the 24 weeks that they're not encouraged to do counseling at the same agency, just because they're
Right.
perpetrators and they're sort of viewed as this, in my opinion, like a very one layered belief system, you know. So
Mm.
as a result of that, not long ago, about 3 months ago, I actually sort of stepped out on my own private practice, and I've created an agency, like my private practice called SAgency, which is S and the word agency, WA,
Yeah.
SAgency WA, and so I've created like an entire different program. A model that doesn't even exist in Perth at the moment. Like ours is the fee for pay service, and so basically, the model is the man will come in for the first 2 to 3 assessments, whether
Hmm.
he's ordered through different avenues, family court, criminal court, partner, whatever it is. He'll come and do the 3 appointments, like an intake, which is like it's a 17-page document that's quite extensive in it, quite confronting as well, because, for example, like one of the sections is what we call an abusive behavior inventory, where
Mhm.
basically it's the Duluth wheel, which has like, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, all the different categories. In each one of those categories, I actually we'll break it down. So we'll say, we're going to do physical abuse now. Have you ever kicked her, punched her, bit her, pushed her, shoved her? So we actually go through and track the behaviors they've done, and we move it through each category. So it's quite a confronting intake.
Yeah,
Upon the end
definitely.
of that, upon the end of that intake, we also will give them the option. They'll have 3 options. The first option will be they just engage in counselling. So say they're ordered through family court to do a men's behaviour change program, or through criminal court. The counselling won't meet that order because it's counselling but with a DV focus on it. So it would meet like a personal development or family and domestic violence counselling order, for example, but that would be their first option. They can just do generic counselling with the DV lens.
Mhm.
Um, the second option is they want to jump into the group and they're group ready. So they just jump into like the 22-week group that we have. And the third option is they want to jump into the group, but they don't feel quite ready. It might be because they need motivational interviewing, they might need to get some case management support. So then we'll give them up to 6 sessions of like group prep, case management, all of that, set them up for group, almost like address that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then push them into, and not push them, but move them into the group. And then as part of the group, they also have the ongoing support of doing additional sessions whenever they want. So, say we do a topic on family of origin, shame, anger, whatever it is. And if they feel like they want to explore that more, they have the options of actually coming in and doing individual sessions for as long as they want, and as many sessions as they want. There's no limit on that as long as they're attending group and engaging in the group. And then upon completion, the other thing that I've noticed in a lot of the places was you'd finish at the end of the 24 sessions, and a lot of men at that point had just started talking, but they weren't. But then they finally start talking by the 4 5 month time mark, and then we were saying to them, well, you're finishing group, see you later. And there were some men, it broke my heart, where they'd say, can I stay in group for longer, can I keep coming back? And I'd have to say to them, I'm so sorry, but you can't.
Yeah.
You've got to leave. So
Mm.
as a result, so basically we've got this program, it's called the maintenance program, where
Mhm.
when they finish the 22 weeks, they can actually then go into what we call the maintenance stage that runs for 8 months. And they meet every 3 weeks, and it's peer driven. So there'll be a facilitator in the room, but they'll sort of be in the background because it's about really creating the space to get men to speak up and stand out to other men. So, for example, the topic might be reparative parenting or co-parenting after separation or whatever it is. And so that will be the topic. And then the men will actually challenge each other, talk to each other, troubleshoot with each other. And that's that ongoing creating conversations and spaces for men that goes
Mhm.
for like 8 months following it as well. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the model. And then at the end of the 8 months, if they want to jump into ongoing, like back into group or into counseling, they have that option to kind of do that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting what you said about um, them wanting to stay on longer because I
Yeah.
guess my next question was going to be how do you work with men who, you know, uh, come to the sessions but aren't willing to, not necessarily to change, but to discuss things yet because, because of the shame or because they don't feel open to it. Like, how do you work with those clients? Because you can never, push people who don't want to be changed. Same with like if you ask someone to go see a psych who haven't been a perpetrator of violence, you can't force them to do it. Um,
Yeah.
so, so what are some techniques you kind of use with guys who are a bit resistant to going to a counselor because of stereotypes around men seeing counselors?
Yeah. So to be honest with you, like it's so interesting, but it's a very small, like, I mean, I guess I'm only speaking from my experience, but it's a very small percentage of men that don't actually want to talk once you create that space. Like, I think there's something that's just absolutely beautiful and so supportive and engaging when men are talking to other men around vulnerability, that even sometimes the most hardened men who come in and are like, this is I was going to swear. Actually, do you allow swearing on the
That's it.
podcast? I
You
don't.
can
Yeah.
say.
You'll have, sorry, I'm just a potty mouth in general because I work with men, so, but I'm always like, can I swear in podcasts? There'll be men that'll come and be like, this is bullshit, rah, rah, rah.
Yeah.
And then, it's that sort of, as a facilitator, you got to hold that balance between nurturing, but also firmness, assertiveness. So like, I've had to say to them, listen, we all have choices. You don't think you have a choice, but even the choice to say you don't have a choice is a choice. So your options are you either engage in group or you sit in. So you engage in group, get something out of it because you're forced or mandated to be here anyway. So you might as well get something out of it. Or you sit here, you don't do anything out of it, get anything out of it, but that's fine. You just don't be disruptive or disrespectful to anyone in the room, and or you just leave. But
Mm.
those are still your options and those are still your choices. So I guess when I've always sort of worked with that, it's been that balance of firmness but nurturing. And then I found when the men do feel like they're supported by a facilitator and the group, I've found men like I said, some of the most hardened, and I've worked with like bikey, like heads of like chapter leaders and guys that are like actively using like they're not supposed to be, but and they tell us they're not, but you can tell they are.
Yeah.
All of that, and they've opened up and they've sort of, even if they get a 2% change in their behaviors or a 5% change, that's still a change that they didn't expect. So I still see it as a win.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So another thing I was thinking about just before doing this podcast was, and we kind of already touched on this a bit, but how do you kind of strike that balance between, I guess, holding the men accountable for their actions, given they
Mm-hmm.
probably have done some pretty confronting things, but also providing them with that support and guidance that they need to change so that it doesn't happen again, so that they can also overcome their own demons, I guess. Um, yeah, how do you kind of strike that balance and work with them, not with
Yeah.
all this knowledge about them? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that again comes down to like the humanistic aspect of like of working with people in this space.
Mm.
In that, I remember when I first started, I'd have those similar questions, and I had this really experienced facilitator, and she'd been working in prisons in like her entire lifespan. She was in her 60s, and she said, think about working with men as the analogy of like an iron fist in a velvet glove. So it's a really firm hold, but it's a soft, it's like a firm hold, but it's a soft hold, if that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
guess, when I work with men, it's that idea of I understand the trauma, I understand
Mm.
the impacts it's had on you. I absolutely am validating your experience of it.
Mm.
Because when you think about it, the biggest perpetrators of violence in society are men, men towards other men towards boys, men towards girls, men towards their partners, men towards animals, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So a lot of the times it's actually validating their experience of potentially having trauma or being a victim of domestic violence themselves or of some form of abuse. And then actually once you've created that space where you create that connection, that validation, and they see that you can see them as a human being that has so many layers to them and not this scary perpetrator.
Mm.
That's when you can actually hold them accountable and be like, mate, you're doing some pretty shitty things. Like literally, like some of these behaviors are really harmful to your family, to your partners, to your soul, even. Like I always sort of connected back to their values. And I say, you might say to me, oh, well, my partner Sue is like this awful person and she should be the one being in group and Sue's done this to me, rah, rah, rah. And I
Mm.
always kind of take it back to them and say, well, I can't speak on Sue and I can't advise on Sue. However, I can say to you that if you don't change your behaviors, if you don't sort of work on yourself, and we all have behaviors that we can work on with ourselves, if you don't change it, there's going to be, I guarantee, a Sue point two, a Sue point three, a Sue point four. She's going to look different, but the exact issues are going to come up every single time. So I
Yeah.
said, my work with you here is I'm invested in working with you. If you give me even 50%, I'll go 150% with you to help you address those behaviors and to get a better quality of life. So in turn, you'll give a better quality of life to your future partners and children or, current partners, whatever it is.
Yeah. Can you describe some of the most common kind of mental health challenges that men in these situations face and how these contribute to violent behavior? Like, what role does trauma play in these men's lives often?
Well, I guess I'll probably turn it back to you and be like, what doesn't trauma play in their lives?
Yeah.
Like literally, like I would say, 90%, actually no, 99% of people that are, perpetrating, there is like that trauma that's happened, whether it's trauma from, emotional abuse, whether it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, but it's always trauma. And it could be trauma from childhood, it could be trauma like at school, it could be trauma that they've experienced in a workplace, but it's all coming from trauma. It's that idea that when a person has had to submit to another entity, give up all their power against their will and have to go along with it, that shame has created such a sense of uh, deficitness in them, of such incompletion, that the only way they can make themselves feel accepted to their own view is to take power over other people, is to
Yeah.
do things over other people, because at some point they've had to give up their power involuntarily, and they just hate that they've had to do it. It
Mm.
makes them feel like they're broken. So that's why they sort of push out
Mm.
onto other people. So there is, correlations with domestic violence with things like ADHD, anxiety, depression, most commonly, also drug use. However, I would say all of that, the big umbrella over all of those things is trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And what are some common stereotypes that you see about perpetrators of violence? Like you mentioned, the media has a huge influence on men seeking help as well.
Yeah.
Um, how do you work to challenge or change those kind of perceptions in the men that come to see you to get help?
Well, um, for me, I'm quite vocal. Probably not the best part of my quality in a way, because I'm quite blunt and brash about it. But I feel strongly about the current stereotypes that are part of like this narrative of domestic violence. Which one of the things is that men are very purposeful in the way they're doing it. They have 100% control over what they're doing, and so for example, they'll be like, oh, a man will come into a room and he'll break every part of like his partner's stuff, and he won't break his things because he's so purposeful in perpetrating the abuse. Yes, that might be one time that he does it. However, I've also seen that same man go and smash his own TV, that's gone and smashed his car, that's hurt himself. And so for me, it's not so what's the word, like one layer. Like domestic violence is not just one layer where men are purposeful, men are evil, men are broken. It's there's so many nuances to it, and I think the stereotypes around the idea of the guy who's drinking beers, unemployed, wearing the wife beater shirt, all of like the football hooligan, all of those. I mean, yeah, there's people that do they match those aspects of it? Yes, they do. However, they also may be fathers, and you're, like I said, your next door neighbor, the guy
Mm.
who does your lawn, whatever it is. So it's so much more. And I think the problem with having these stereotypes around men being these purposeful perpetrators that are almost like crawling out of like Jackson Katz talks about, crawling out of the swamps and hurting the people and crawling back into the swamps. The problem with that narrative is that it creates an us and a them, and it prevents men who are using unhealthy behaviors or abusive behaviors from engaging with support early intervention in the early intervention space.
Mhm.
So shame that's like created by these narrative stereotypes will actually prevent men from engaging from the later. They'll sort of push it back, and then when they're perpetrated and they're being charged, that's when they're coming into groups, and it's almost too late then for their kids and their partners. So it's more about this creating that space around, let's remove these stereotypes, let's be honest about it, let's be real about that. Your perpetrator could be your next door neighbor, the guy you work with, even your own boss, whatever it is. Let's talk about it, let's call it shame, let's name it, name it for what it is, and then work with it, and allow create those spaces of vulnerability.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what role does that kind of education and awareness aspect play in your work? Like, how do you engage? Do you engage communities in addressing the issue of sexual and domestic violence, or is it focused just on the men and them overcoming these stereotypes?
Yeah, it's a bit of column A and column B, to be honest. So at SAgency, like we're very passionate about working with the men, and having that focus on helping create those spaces for men to engage in the work.
Mhm.
However, I'm also quite passionate about creating like spaces in the community to talk about it and challenge these things. And like I said, it's been an interesting space setting up my private practice, because I have actually been met with some backlash around this idea of, well, no, you're not calling it domestic violence. You're not calling it, perpetrating. You're not using those language. And so what that's doing is it's allowing men to get off scot-free. It's allowing men to hide in, whatever else. And, so my thing back to that I'm sort of promoting and talking about, I guess even by being on a podcast like this, is this idea that men don't need to call themselves perpetrators to get the help. They know in their heart the behaviors that they're doing are not okay. The majority of them. They know that the behaviors they're doing are unhealthy. However, when you sort of say you have to call yourself a perpetrator in order to get help, you have to say you're domestically violent in order to get help, I think that's absolutely wrong in my view. I don't think it's holistic. I don't think it's healthy. And it's just creating this really unhealthy narrative, because I also think if you're demonizing men and with these stereotypes, and then most of these men are in families, right? So then if this boy or girl is looking up a dad who's been called this swamp monster, perpetrator, all of those awful things, then they're going to go, well, I'm half mum and I'm half dad. So if I'm half dad, what does that make me? Am I also like this half evil deficit character? And the same thing goes for with women. So, with women and like being with partners that are abusive, it's this idea of, well, if I'm purposefully choosing, or if I'm choosing unconsciously even, men that are these demons and monsters, well, what's wrong with me? Am I broken? Am I the same level as them? So it actually, having those stereotypes doesn't just impact the men, it impacts it like on a very global level, because it's impacting those kids and their partners and those partners who will repartner and those kids that will have kids, so it's a huge knock-on effect that I think we need to stop, and we need to start looking at them as, we need to engage in early intervention. We need to engage men in having those spaces where they can say, yeah, I'm unhealthy or I'm being abusive, and not have to just, before they do that, admit to being a perpetrator, so to speak, or admit to saying, oh, yes, I use domestic violence. Like, I don't see the point in that. I can't see why men just can't say, I'm abusive or I'm unhealthy, you know. So the language that in our flyers, for example, is a little bit more softer. We talk about things like unhealthy relationships, conflict management, and that's where like the backlash has come a bit, in that we're not naming it as domestic violence. But I'm like, but if I can get a man to engage in a space of conflict management, which is the biggest reason why men use abuse in their relationships, if I can get them engaged in that space of conflict management, or like assertive communication as opposed to aggressive, empathy, perspective taking, what the end result is still safety. So what does it matter whether I say conflict management or domestic abuse? To me, it makes no sense. However, like, I do know there's been a bit of a backlash in my program, but that's okay, because I'm focused on what I'm doing. We have a goal, we have a mission, and so we're doing things like webinars, promoting it online. Men can access this openly. We can have those conversations. It's free of service. We're also engaging in creating webinars for other providers like nurses. Because, for example, like a nurse might go into a home as an allied health, and she might see abusive behaviors of the man or the woman who's doing particular like victim survivor behaviors, and a lot of times I found they don't know what to do with that later, and so they leave that house thinking there's something here and I don't know how to address it or start those conversations. So we're actually creating a webinar series that's coming out in December, especially Christmas time, to help nurses. And we're also, the other place that we're looking at promoting and talking about it is in the family legal space, because, lawyers, they do their law stuff for 4 years or, whatever it is. I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't be able to comment on that. But I've been told by a few of them that there's like the few sections on mental health. They understand domestic violence by the letter of the law, but however, they're not sort of, I guess, experiencing the nuances of domestic violence with regards to, like, I was talking to one lawyer and I said, the Duluth Wheel. And, she was like, what's that? I've never heard of that. And I was like, oh, did you guys, is that not a unit in law where you look at family law and one of the family law might be coercive control or domestic violence? And she said, that's not been something that's been provided. So even creating training like CPD through, like, say in Perth, like Pilkingtons or Australian College of Law, where we create like family and domestic violence awareness series. So, for example, being able to have that ABI, the abusive behavior inventory, chat with the man as your client, if you're having the chat with a woman, is he doing these behaviors? Are you safe if we do family court orders? Because is he likely to kind of accelerate in this ABI, abusive behaviors? Also doing a risk assessment. How can you do a risk assessment with a woman who's saying, I don't, uh, you know, because, sometimes when people separate, there will be like very real reasons for conflict and the woman saying she's unsafe. And sometimes it's a result of the huge separation and the stress and the anxiety. So, and a lot of the times, I think family law sees it that couples, when women in particular are calling out family and domestic violence, it's a result of their stress and their anxiety, as opposed to they might actually seriously be feeling scared and fearful of their partner, because yes, he's not hitting her, but he's been doing coercive control their whole relationship.
Mm.
So, one of the webinars that I'm designing at the moment is looking at when a woman says she's unsafe, how do you do a risk assessment to pick up the unsafe behaviors that aren't the in your face behaviors, the coercive
Yeah.
controlling things. And then so you can present that in court and support her the best way and validate her experience. So yeah, we're
Yeah.
doing a few different series around and the podcast as well. And
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. And going back to what you said before about the language, I think that's really true, and it's something that's not really talked about much, that the language that you use affects everyone else around them as well, like the partner or the kids. But also, it promotes shame further in the men who are being told they're perpetrators. So yeah, I agree with that. I think it's good to kind of change the language for everyone's benefit.
And
Um,
also in particular, sorry,
you're right.
I was just going to say with like multicultural spaces,
Mm,
the other thing that I've seen is that working in this space for as long as I have, a lot of like most of the programs, and I hate to say this, but being a woman of color, it's my experience because I've worked with men of color, is
mhm.
that the programs are whitewashed.
Yeah,
It does not take into account people's ethnic backgrounds, where they've come from, their country of origin, and the shame, because there's different communities where shame is viewed in different ways.
yeah,
Japanese shame would be something different to like Indian men shame to
mm,
like an Italian man shame. So the shame in different cultures is seen differently.
yeah,
So it's like when we don't talk about shame, when we don't even look at people's families of origin, their culture, that's the other, I guess, part of the narratives that aren't being looked at. And
mm,
for as long as I've started, I remember like beating the drum saying, when we do these programs, we need to meet with like members of like the Muslim community or like the Italian community, the African community. We need to meet with them and ask them what is the best practice um, for them. Like, how can we
mm.
help them? And to be honest with you, and again, this is my experience, but I've been in this space for like 8 years now in Perth. I have not seen any programs that have been culturally, responsive to that at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that next. So, how do you kind of approach the different factors like race or socioeconomic status and the culture
Yeah.
when working with these men? Because, yeah, obviously people have different um, understanding of different words and they're brought up to believe
Yeah.
different things. So, how do you approach these variations for different people?
Well, basically include them in the conversations, like ask them. So,
Yeah.
like I said, meeting with, multicultural services, meeting with leaders of the different like spaces, like
Mm,
African communities, Indian communities, and asking them, what do you need? So for one of the organizations that I was working for, there was this space where if you were from a CALD background, you could get individualized therapy,
mhm,
as part of the domestic violence. However, the funding for that didn't run over and it got cut. And so it went back to then again, generic group work. So it's like there are differences. We need to address them. How do we do it? Ask them what works for them. And, even create individual therapy options and create, programs that might be including like parts of that. So when we talk about family of origin, ask them their experience of the men in the group. And also additionally, talk to your facilitators, train your facilitators that are working for you to have that knowledge. Because we do a lot on Aboriginal people, and that's so amazing that Australia has, incorporated that as part of, like as part of standard practice. And
mm,
a lot of places also have like inclusivity with the LGBTQ
yeah.
community. And I just think this is the next level because we do some sort of like, multicultural stuff, but most places they don't as their standard practice.
Yeah.
So, I've had facilitators go, well, I don't know how to work with this man. He's like Hindu and Punjabi, and, he says that's his community and that's his culture. And how do I question that?
Mm.
And so for me, when I've worked with people like that, because I'm Indian, I can say, you know what? Yes, that is a standard practice in India. However, it's a very outdated practice, and
Yeah.
there's lots of different pockets in India where people, women and men, are protesting about this. Domestic violence is illegal. Like, yes, it might still be done, but it's not approved. And also, the World Health Organization says all across the world, every man, woman, and child needs to be living free of fear. So, when you can have these honest conversations, that's what would create holistic work. However, if your facilitators don't know how to work with men in those spaces, it's not going to create the work.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. More generally, what are some effective therapeutic approaches or interventions that you use for addressing the mental health needs of these men?
Yeah. So I think that most men's behavior change programs, they have like a stock standard, um, what do you call it, like different therapy modules that they work with.
Hmm.
So, there's generically like CBT, which would be great for, unpacking emotions, helping them understand like the emotional awareness side of it, the regulating, the challenging unhelpful thoughts,
Hmm.
questioning your narratives, questioning your belief systems. So, CBT can work really great in that space. So
Hmm.
there'll be in the 22 to 24 weeks that programs do, there will be like a big chunk of that will be a CBT section
Yeah.
around all of those sorts of work that you can work with. A lot then you'll sort of move on to things like attachment, so like attachment therapy, and that will be more related along to things like with children. So the impacts of domestic violence on children, the reparative fathering, how do you repair relationships once there has been an attachment disruption or an attachment break? So that sort of will have a big chunk of it with attachment. Then you've got like the humanistic side of it, that is more that person centered, that idea that Carl Rogers says, that unconditional positive regard. And that would be along the sessions around, helping them, showing them that unconditional positive regard in terms of like empathy for them, perspective, and showing them how you can see their perspective, that hopefully in turn will help them, create that for themselves and their partners and their children around them. So around things like empathy, perspective taking, that helping them understand that one of the units is like drugs and alcohol don't cause domestic violence. Like it is, always say it's like a lock combination. So it's like issue, maladaptive coping mechanisms, and then drugs and alcohol. So it's
Okay.
like lock clicks, lock clicks, lock clicks, and then bam, it's like an episode. It's
Hmm.
not just like, oh, I did drugs and now I'm a violent person, because a lot of people do drugs or they drink alcohol and they're not abusive. So it's that idea of, it's like your ongoing issue, your maladaptive coping mechanisms, and the use of drugs and alcohol. That's what's the issue. But
Yeah.
even to get to that space, it's that creating that person-centered approach where you can be like, this is what, I'm here to listen to you, but I'm also here to challenge you with that like idea of the iron fist and the velvet glove concept.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And what role does, I guess, like toxic masculinity and societal pressures come into impacting the mental health of these men as well? And how do you work around that to kind of aim to challenge these norms or change that perception?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Toxic masculinity, what I call the collective socialization of men and women. They all create these huge problems in society that
Mm.
people aren't even aware of, because the toxic, well, we'll start with what I call the collective socialization of men and women, right? From the moment we're born, we're gendered,
Mm.
and it's, I guess, for more like millennials upwards, it's like pink and blue, and,
Yeah.
boy and girl, and, all of those sorts. It was so specific. I remember like my son would be playing with like a Barbie or whatever, and my husband's dad would be like, oh, don't do that, boys don't do that, or don't cry, come on, just don't cry. And I was like,
Mm.
from birth, we've sort of like ingesting all these views, whether it's on the TV, whether it's at school, whether it's through our
Yeah.
parents, grandparents, etc. So
Mhm.
that's what I call like the collective socialization, of men and women. What that does though is like it also creates this space where men start policing men on their behaviors. They start
Mm-hmm.
policing themselves on their behaviors, and then women start policing men on their behaviors. So, for example, like I can speak from my experience growing up, like being from like an ethnic background and being in the age group where like the Fast and the Furious was like the movie of the day. Like,
Yeah.
I just remember, like for me, like a typical alpha male in my head was like Vin Diesel or like The Rock with like
Yeah.
muscles and there was that real toxic masculinity, like
Mm.
dudes riding through traffic and stuff. And
Yeah.
my first relationship, as a result, was very abusive because he literally looked like one of the guys that could be on Fast and the Furious, and he
Yeah.
acted though like in the most, like when I think back now, I was 19 when I met him. He was 7 years older. It went on for 4 years, this relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
he literally did almost everything on that Duluth wheel to me, like literally, you know. But I didn't understand that because when I would meet like nicer, like I remember I was always like the more tomboy girl. So
Mm-hmm.
when I would have friends, and I had some amazing guy friends, and when they would show interest in me because they were like the nice guys or they were the gentle guys, I was like, no, sorry, like that's not what I want, because
Yeah.
I was policing them. I know unconsciously I was policing them and saying that's not a real man, So I think that's what that collective socialization does. And then men do it to women as well. They'll police them in like, well, girls, shouldn't, like girls shouldn't be playing sport, like as a, when you have girls that are wanting to do football or whatever, as a parent, or women shouldn't be speaking up in like these spaces of domestic violence. That makes you a feminist or a feminazi or a lesbian, and so they start policing you, and then even women will police women on it. Women will often like come to me and they'll say, "Oh, how can you work in that space? Aren't you scared? What, like, yeah, how do you engage with them?" And I always say to them, I feel more unsafe as a woman walking down the street after dark to my car than I do when I'm in a room with, say, like 10 to 12 men who've just come from prison.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's something again about when you create spaces for men to be themselves and to call other men on it, that they're not going to attack me because there's 10, like let's say there's 10 men, one of them is kicking off. I've actually heard and seen where men will be like, "Oh, mate, shut the fuck up!" Like they'll call them on it because that's men standing up to other men. Whereas when you're out in public, where men are just not checking themselves and they're not aware of these like policing that they're doing or biases that they have, and if they're alone or in a group, yeah, you're more likely to be attacked. You're more likely to be unsafe. So I guess that's what that collective socialization, it can be quite problematic for men and women. And I guess, I think when I think about toxic masculinity, it's this idea that it's toxic for both men and women, like masculinity and
Yeah.
femininity, because of the socialization. However, like toxic masculinity has kind of almost become the buzzword, for it.
Yeah.
So that would be my answer to the first part of the question. The second part of how do I work with it, once again, naming it and claiming it, giving them my experience of it, like I just talked to you about it,
Yeah.
humanizing that this is an experience we all have. But I also love doing this activity, which was a concept that was brought to me by an American speaker. His name is Tony Porter, Porter, and he talks about the idea of the man box. So he talks about how, from a young age, men are collectively, again, socialized to be things like not cry, not show
Yeah.
emotions, be faster than girls, be stronger than girls, to not be gay, and all of those sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
And so he talks about it being in this box that kind of like traps men into like this idea of how they should be, and as a result, depression rates are higher, suicide rates are higher, family and domestic violence rates are higher. So usually there is, for myself, like when I've done these programs, I'll introduce that concept to them, even if it's not in the curriculum. I'll just put the video on. But in my
Yeah.
program, it is very much part of the curriculum over a
Yeah.
few sessions, even. And we'll just kind of watch the video, get their feedback on what were the things you were socialized about. Then I'll give them all a piece of paper and get them to like draw a box on it and write about all the things that they were boxed into. And then talk about it in the group, like what was the things that you were boxed into, what were the things you were boxed into, and then draw a second box, which would be like with their children, and what are the things that you want to give to your children? Not so much a box, but what are the values that you want to pass down that are positive? If it's a girl, can she be a football player? If it's a boy, can he be a ballerina? Or maybe it's not, but whatever it is, how do you
Yeah.
have those conversations? So, just again, awareness, space to unpack it, and supporting each other.
Yeah. Yeah, great. And let's discuss next the importance of kind of long-term rehab and ongoing support for individuals who have committed acts of violence. Because you said, at the start that you have people that go through this 24-week program, they want to have more. Um,
Yeah,
what are some of the challenges, but also the positive outcomes of sustaining this work over time?
as in for the men.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
and for you working with them as
yeah,
well. Yeah.
yeah. So one of the things I have seen is, unfortunately, because some of the current models are very much around the 24 weeks with no additional support around it. I've seen men almost do like the revolving door around it. So they've
Mhm.
finished the program for a particular crime. A few months or a few years later, they're back in the program. And there was this one particular man. I think he did the program like mandated and not mandated 4 times. That was
Mhm.
24 times. Like, so
Yeah.
24 sessions times four, and he was
Yeah.
still perpetrating. And his kids,
Mm,
and he had 5 or 6 kids,
mm,
multiple, they were all removed off him and his partner. And
yeah.
so I guess, it's this idea that long term work needs to be ongoing.
Yeah.
It's like when those men in the group are asking and saying, "Can I stay on?" There needs to be ongoing support for them to do it. Like, I've
Yeah.
had conversations with men in this space where they're like, "I don't want to leave because I'm scared when I go out in the real world without the support and something happens, I've got no one to talk to." So then as a result, I kind of made it my mission a little bit for a while there to like go out there and see what was out there for them. And, aside from individual therapy, there isn't anything like, so you
Mm,
can do a mandated group and then jump into a voluntary group and then do another 24 sessions.
yeah.
However, once you finish the voluntary group, unless you jump into another voluntary group, like, and there's only like 3 providers, 4 providers in
Mm,
Perth that do it, there's no on term, like long term ongoing work. And when men are
yeah.
asked in the voluntary group, can I redo it? They're like, you have to wait like almost a year to redo it. You can't just
Okay.
jump back into it, right? So
Mm,
they're like, your options would be then online
yeah.
or, like Changing for Good is one where you can have like a one-on-one counselor either online or over the phone, or you can do
Mhm.
your on individual therapy. However, men's space is very important for men to do it with groups. Like, that's how
Yeah.
change is. Like, all the studies show that change happens in groups with men.
Okay.
Individual work is not best practice
Mhm.
with regards to behavior change, because things like, as a therapist, like your personal biases will come into the play. There's
Yeah.
colluding that might be happening. There's grooming that might be happening. There's also, it becomes like a standoff sometimes, like where you're saying to the man, "This is abusive," and he's like, "Well, that's your opinion," and you're like,
Mm,
"No, it is," and he's like, "That's your opinion," and we'll be like, "Let's agree to disagree." So
yeah.
for those reasons, individual work is not the best practice. It's group practice. However, there just isn't like, there's no groups that, like I said, you do a mandated group and then you can jump into another group, but usually the voluntary ones, there's a 6 to 8 month wait list. 6 to 8 months. So a man's finished a group, he's got to wait 6 to 8 months to jump into another group. Then he
Mm,
wants to jump into another group, and again 6 to 8 months. And then the other downside of that is, if they don't admit to being a perpetrator with the voluntary groups, they're not let in.
mm,
So a lot of them have questions like, do you use abuse? Do you use domestic violence? Are you a perpetrator? Like, one of them, actually, the question was quite blunt. Are you a perpetrator of family and domestic violence? And if they say no, it's, well, you're not eligible.
right. Mm,
So um, it needs to be ongoing. It needs to be holistic, and it needs to be available. And at the moment, unfortunately, the current systems, as great as they are, and as great as the facilitators are, and as great as the agencies are that are providing it, we need more. We need more help for men. We need more funding for men, and we need, as much as women are advocating for women, and that's such an amazing thing to see, because there was a time when we couldn't do it. However, there needs to be men in this space, and even women in this space, that are that have done their work, though, that understand domestic violence, and are wanting to support men, and speaking up for it. Because the other thing is that, as women, like, I was talking to someone else the other day, and she was saying she went to a psychology like catch up, and they were all talking about what they specialize in, and there was 14 women in this group, and they
Yeah.
all talked about what they do, and not one said they work with men. In fact, they all said that they don't work with men specifically. So
Yeah.
we were talking about this idea that if a man calls up, he's got to go through 13 no's because she said she would work with men. But he's got to go through 13 no's before he has one woman that will say, I'll work with you. So
Yeah.
that's quite problematic in on its own. And
Mm.
then the other thing that I've seen is men are now speaking up about it, about accessing help and getting support. But it's almost like the pendulum has swung from like one extreme to the other, because you now have men who haven't done their work. So they might not be qualified uh, in some form of counseling. Not it doesn't have to be like a postgrad, but even some form of counseling or some form of personal therapy or some form of even doing their own work. They haven't done the work. So when they sort of come at it, it's this idea of like, women get all the good stuff, we don't, and family court's unfair to women and it's not fair to us. And there's men in there that are promoting speaking up and supporting other men. But if a man would, I can guarantee, go to them and say, I'm feeling suicidal or whatever, there's not enough qualifications or experience there to support that man. And
Yeah.
that's also problematic about men working in this space. It needs to be men and women working in this space who can do the work, are passionate about it, and are qualified in it.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot that still needs to be addressed there. Um,
Yeah.
let's talk about within your practice, how do you kind of measure and track the progress in terms of mental health improvement within your program? And what outcomes have you observed in terms of reduced recidivism and healthier
Mhm.
behaviors?
Um, so all the programs across Australia have their minimum standard guidelines. So any program that calls itself a men's behaviour change program, it has to abide by these guidelines. And I think it's like this yay chunk document. So I
Yep.
remember when I started my practice, I went through it like a fine tooth comb. And there's things like, for example, you have to have one facilitator that's like a level 2 and a level 3. So like a level 2 is like an undergrad, level 3 is a postgrad. So
Hmm.
when you're facilitating, it has to be always a man and a woman, except on like particular circumstances when like leave, sickness, holidays.
Hmm.
And you have to also have a certain amount of observed hours. You have to be doing ongoing development in regards to things like culture, gender, sexuality, and all of that sort of stuff. So those are your minimum standard guidelines that everyone that calls themselves a men's behavior change program has to like abide to. So I guess with regards to like standards and guidelines, that's what we also abide to. So like I've made
Yep.
sure like I've gone through it with a fine tooth comb, and there's like two parts to SAgency WA's responsive and safe program. There's myself and there's Amy. So Amy, she works in the justice system as well, like as a clinical social worker with men. So
Hmm.
she does she does sort of the tracking of how our standards are being met. So I'll sort of go through it, and then she's my checks and balances to make sure that from a justice perspective as well, that we're meeting all those checks and balances. So I guess that's how we meet our guidelines. With regards to tracking progress, so we implement quite a few different things. So number one, there's this thing called Outcome Star, which is like a worldwide, like it's a worldwide measurement tool, right? And it's got like different things on it, like Empowerment Star, Justice Star, Community Star, and it's looking at things like, for example, like with us, we use Justice Star for the men. It looks at things like your use of violence, your engagement with the community, your connection to your family, pro-social activities, employment, accommodation. So it's sort of looking at it from a very holistic way. So when we engage the men in our program, the 22-week program, they will do an outcome star, the justice star at the start. They'll do it in the middle, and they'll do it at the end. So that will give them that, you know, progress that they can see visually as well, because it goes from 1 is like low and 10 is amazing.
Yep.
So there's that part of it. And then when they move into the maintenance, we continue it again to create those longitudinal studies as well, like data collection, because Triangle, which is the people that have done Outcome Star, it can be, the information can be actually collected, data collected, and long-term studies could be used from that.
Yep.
So we use that. We also use with the men like self-reporting forms, where basically they self-report every 3 weeks, like a list of behaviors, which is similar to ABI. Have you done these behaviors? And that's collected as part of their time in the group.
Yep.
So that's being recorded alongside their progress. And we
Hmm.
also use with individual sessions and the group one, Scott D. Miller's, the SRS, ORS, the measurement. It's like that 10 centimeter like measurement, like 1 and 10, and then you
Yep.
like someone draws a line on the line and you go and measure it, like old school, like psych tools.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
motivational interviewing one. Yeah.
Yeah, so we use that as well, which is like worldwide again. So that's like a
Mhm.
worldwide data collection space.
Yeah.
Um, Also, part of like our men's behavior change program that we offer, and this is all behavior change programs have to offer this, is that there's the counterpart to the men's work, which is the partner contact work.
Hmm.
So every man that engages in the program, if he has the information, and he has to provide information of current ex-partners, partners, and kids that are impacted by his use of violence. So
Hmm.
then we've got a partner contact team who, within 48 hours, once again required by minimum standards, has to make contact with them, and sort of advise them like your partner, ex-partner is engaged in behavior change, um, and we're here to support you from the partner contact perspective of it. So when we work with them, we also use outcome staff, but it's called empowerment staff for the women. So once
Hmm.
again, they do it at the start, middle, and end. And then there's
Yeah.
also the Scott Miller's like tracking one as well. So
Yeah.
quite a lot of checks and balances. Oh, and we also use the WAST, WAIST. It's once again like a worldwide women's advocacy intervention tool, something like that, that also tracks their feelings of safety. So it's
Hmm.
almost like each group, the men and the women, have three checks and balances on each end.
Yeah.
Because I'm very passionate about, we're doing this hard work, we need to track it. Because
Yeah.
I have seen in my time outcomes. I have seen men. I mean, yes, they haven't flipped the switch completely and become saints, but I think, like I said, even if it's a 5% change, that's still a 5% change for that family and kids. And that needs to be tracked, and we need to be showing those changes. So,
Mm. Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah, you want to be seeing the outcomes. Um, what advice or guidance would you offer to listeners who might be either personally affected by sexual or domestic violence or know someone who is? How can they be a part of the solution?
Yeah. I think if you know someone, and this is like once again personal experience of being a victim, but also knowing women that are and working in the space that it is, I think it's being a friend and a family member in specific can be quite a disempowering space because you're seeing the people you care about getting hurt. So it can be quite disempowering, and there can be times when you get angry at them, and you just want to shake them and be like, "Just leave this space." I'm going to do it for you or whatever. But I think unfortunately they're on their journey just the way that I was, and the more I would have people tell me not to, the more it would create shame in me, and as a result, I actually withdrew from most of my family and friends when I was going through my stuff. So I guess it's that space of like, as a family member or a friend, if you see someone that's experiencing it, I think it's creating a space for them to go on their journey. However, also as that family and friend, you have to engage in your work so that when you do have feelings of frustration or anger at them, that you have a different outlet, whether it's a counselor or a friend. Hopefully,
Mm.
I'd like to say a counselor,
Yeah.
because there's people that specialize. Like you could call up 1-800 respect, and they would
Mm.
tell you how to support your friend. And I think
Yeah.
that's the better way to do it than to sort of push them and challenge them and then walk away from them when they don't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And then how do you, as someone who works with perpetrators of violence daily, how do you maintain your own mental health? Like you said, you talk a lot about your own shame and you have to be very honest um, with the men as well. And so I guess it would be quite confronting. So how do you kind of maintain your own mental health and maintain a, I guess, positive perspective or positive outlook?
Yeah. A lot of brie cheese and peanut M&Ms.
Yep.
and
Really cool.
and wine. But no, it's like this weird, like I have this weird thing where if I've had a really bad day, you'll know I've had a bad day because I've gone to the supermarket and I've grabbed like a wheel of cheese and peanut
Yep.
M&Ms, and I've sat in my car and I've eaten them together. It's the like weird
Okay.
combination of like cheese and chocolate.
Fair enough.
And I've literally not even waited till I got home. I was like, I need to eat it now. So
Yep.
sometimes it's those kinds of moments. Another thing I do is like I love music. So
Hmm.
again, my partner will know when I've had like a challenging day where I've been called like a feminist or a lesbian or a Nazi or whatever it is. He'll know because I'll come home to like blaring like, I don't know, like DMX or like Limp Bizkit, like something really loud. And
Yep.
it's like that release where the noise in my head's so loud that I'm like, I'm just going to make the noise around me
Love
louder
it.
to drown that out. Yeah. So I do
Yeah.
that. But lastly, the thing that's most important to me is like bracketing. So when I first started, because these men are so good at hiding those aspects of them that you don't see, that you see like your next door neighbor, you see your whatever policeman, you see your gardener. So when I'd go home, like I kept thinking, oh my God, like who among me is these people? Who among me of my friends are in these relationships? And how do I help these women in these relationships? Because if I don't see the men like so obviously, well then their family and friends don't. So how do I support these women? And I got so caught up in it and I couldn't let go of it. And
Yeah.
so I remember taking it to my supervision, obviously. But I took it to my supervision, and he goes to me, well, therapists do things like close their drawers with their files in it, or count the traffic lights on the way home, or imagine you're taking a hat off and putting a hat on. And I was like, but in the world of like digital that we live in, we no longer have like file cabinets anymore. Like it's all
Mm,
online, it's on your laptop.
mm,
You can drive, but most of us like will either catch the train or bus, and or we are driving like shorter distances now, or COVID, we're working from home. So you don't have that ability to like, have that
connect.
massive disconnect.
Yeah.
So something that I have done, and I always tell supervisees when I'm training them, is have something physical. So as a result of the conversation with my supervisor, he goes, I'm sort of imagining with you, and he would do the same thing with me. Like you'd need a shield, something you can hold up that's part of who you are when you're in a group. And when you leave the group, you take that shield off. And I was
Mhm.
thinking, well, what could I do that would mimic that in like a very physical way? Because I'm a very
Mhm.
physical, visual person. So I started buying like really chunky rings, like quite big rings, and I'd put them on my
Yeah.
finger. And so I'd put the ring on, and I'd have like one on each hand or a few on each hand. I put those rings on, and I would only wear them at work. I would never ever wear them out. I would never wear them at home. So I'd get in my
Okay.
car. I'd get in my car, and I also had a watch as well. It was like a Frida Kahlo watch. I still have it, and I still wear it.
Mhm.
So I'll put on my Frida Kahlo watch because the feminist in me, and then I'll put on these rings, and then I'm like in group. And then when I
Mhm.
get out of group and I get in my car, I take my watch and my rings off, and I put it into my little like side section thingy,
Yeah.
and then that's Alison and group gone. And because the clothes I wear, again, I'm very casual. I'm very like I want men to see me as like a normal human being. So I don't tend to wear office clothes as well when I go to
Yep.
work. Like a lot of the times I'm wearing like jeans and a t-shirt and
Mhm.
sneakers, or just like a dress or whatever.
Yeah.
So those are also the clothes I would wear in my everyday life. So
Mm.
that's why when I had to use something that was very specific, and it's those
Yeah.
rings and that watch that is not who I am in my everyday life, and
Yeah.
that's my bracketing that allows me to step away.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how that works, having something like physical that just, yeah, allows
Yeah.
you to kind of disconnect from that.
Have you ever done that before yourself? Like not the rings, but something.
Um, I haven't really. I mean, I haven't been working intensely with clients yet. So at the moment, I've been doing things like autism assessments and
Yeah.
working as a positive behavior support practitioner. So um, I guess I haven't really had anything that's hugely confronting yet. But I
Yeah.
can definitely imagine how, yeah, you would need something just to kind of step away. And as you said, like
Yeah.
working from home, it makes it difficult when your office space is the same space as
Yeah.
your home. So
Yeah.
yeah, I can definitely see how you need that thing to kind of disconnect and step away from the day. Yeah.
Even when I was working with kids though, like I had a different, not uniform, but I had different clothes. So because I know kids as well, like you're working in that space with even the assessments, but kids can be quite challenging too,
Yeah.
because you can like being a mum of like four anyway for
Mm.
myself. Sometimes I get that crazy transference. So
Yeah.
even having clothes that I would wear only at work. So like I'd wear when I work with kids a lot of like line like the cartoony shirts. Like I'd go to Big
Yeah.
W and buy like the size 14 or 12 of like the kids' clothes, and I'd wear
Yeah.
like all your like cartoony shirts, and they'd be like, "Oh my God, I love your shirts and everything." So that would be like a way I disconnect, even when I would work with kids. So I think it's really important to create a work version of you that's part of who you are, but also part different, and then have your home version of you as well.
Yeah, definitely. I guess that is something that I do. I do wear office clothes and things that I won't wear, like I dress more
Mm.
casually when I'm not at work. And yeah, that's definitely something like coming home and getting changed and getting out of that
Yeah,
mindset is something that, yeah, helps me.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I've just got one more question. Um, this doesn't have to be related to what we discussed today, but I just ask this at the end of every podcast. What is your favorite fact in general about psychology?
My favorite fact about psychology. I have one of my favorite facts that I always say to the guys in group is it's not about the bins.
No.
Yeah, and then I'll explain it. So basically, it's for the people that avoid conflict in their relationships. So you'll have the men that go, well, we never argued. We never ever argued. And then one day she just blew up about me not putting the bins out. And then I yelled at her and I pushed her and then she left me. And he's like, but I don't get it. Like for 25 years, we never argued. What was happening there? And, I always say lack of conflict is still conflict avoidance. It's still like conflict. So, I always, when it's for those men, or when men are like, oh, she just blew up out of nowhere. Like, I'm changing now, but she's not changing. She's just blowing up out of nowhere. And I always say, like, it's not about the bins. It's this idea that it's not about the issue that's being brought up in the moment. You
Yep.
need to contextualize it and think about what are the other behaviors. So whenever a man brings something up like that sort of a sentence, I always say, not about the bins. Like, yes, okay, Alison. Or they'll be
Thanks.
like, oh, they'll say to each other and they get it. So yeah, it's not about the bins, guys.
Yeah. Good mantra to have. Well, thank you
Yeah.
again so much for coming on. It was really interesting actually to get this kind of different perspective. Because often I think we hear a lot about, um, the women and like women's shelters, and which is great, but we don't get
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
perspective of the perpetrators and what their background is. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you so
And
much for your time and for having
yeah,
me on to talk about this. Yeah, like you said,
yeah,
people don't talk about it often. So thank you.
yeah. No, it's been great. Thank you so much.